All right, welcome back, Bio. We are in our last week of information, basically our last week of school and your last week of video lessons. So we are going to kind of beast through the rest of this and then we'll be done. So today we are talking about subphylum Vertebrata again, except now we are talking about the typical nervous system of organisms in this subphylum. And so this image here that you see that way behind me is kind of the typical layout for members of this subphylum. However, there's a great deal of diversity within this, and so there are really complex examples, and then there's more simplified examples of nervous systems in this boat. Okay, and so talking about the nervous system, humans, of course, have the most complex nervous system of all animals, and we are members of this subphylum as well. And the nervous system in most vertebrata members is controlled by the brain, just like ours is. And most brains are segmented into about 5 different lobes. The olfactory lobe, which receives signals and receptors from your nose so you can smell. The cerebrum, which integrates sensory information and coordinates a creature's response to that information. We have an optic lobe, which receives signals and receptors from our eyes so we can see. The cerebellum, which controls the involuntary actions and refines your muscle movements as we move. And the medulla oblongata, which coordinates vital functions and transport of various signals from the brain to your spinal cord. And with the exception of the cerebellum, all of these lobes come in pairs of either left or right sides. And so originally, scientists thought that the left lobe controlled the left side of the body and the right lobe of all of these controlled the right side of the body. But in most vertebrates, it's actually vice versa. So your left lobe controls your right side and your right lobe controls your left side. They crisscross. And each side or each area actually has a different area of expertise. So for example, math and analytical skills, including speech and reasoning, are influenced on the left side of the cerebrum more than the right side. So if you're someone who's gifted at math and analytical things, let's say Mr. Turner, for example, that side of your brain is more developed and has more connections than the other side. So, fun fact. All right, and so to send signals to control bodily functions, the signal from your brain has to travel down the medulla oblongata into your spinal cord. And your spinal cord, as you guys know, runs down through your vertebral column because those vertebrae, those bones, are protecting your spinal cord. And this sends signals to and from the brain up and down. And also, your spinal cord has many spinal nerves that are running through it, and those run out throughout your body, and they control where the signals are sent. And so you have 2 sets of these nerves. You have those nerves that are for sensory, and then you have those that are for motor. So your sensory nerves, those transmit signals to the brain from receptors that are located throughout your body. Basically, they allow for sensing changes in your environment. So these sensory nerves are on your fingertips and such, and they're sensing things around us, temperature, pain, pressure, those types of things. And they send signals back up to your brain to say that it's hot, we need to sweat to cool down, or we're in pain, we need to send a pain signal kind of thing. Whereas your motor nerves, those take signals from the brain so the body can do what the brain wants it to. It's the other direction. Sensory nerves go up to the brain to tell what's going on in the environment, while motor nerves tell the body how to respond to whatever your brain thinks that you need to do in that condition. And so both of these, work concurrently together to tell your body what's going on in and around you and how it should respond. All right, and so then we're going to talk about the reproductive system of members of subphylum Vertebrata. And these, in these vertebrates, the sexes are always separate. In some of the past units that we've studied, we saw hermaphrodites and some that could be male and female and so on and so forth. But in this case, all the sexes are separate. You have distinctly male and female organisms. So there are two types of fertilization that can occur within this subphylum. We can have either an internal fertilization or an external fertilization. And in an internal fertilization, the process includes the male placing the sperm inside the female's body where the eggs are fertilized internally. Whereas externally, the female lays the eggs and then the male fertilizes them on the outside of the female's body. And so, of course, you guys know that as humans, we are examples of internal fertilization, but there are other creatures that utilize external fertilization. Mostly aquatic vertebrates utilize external, and mostly land-dwelling, like ourselves, utilize internal fertilization. However, it's an important distinction to make that the production of eggs does not necessarily mean the creature reproduces by external fertilization. So those eggs can still be fertilized internally before they are laid. So just because there's eggs does not mean that it's always external fertilization. So that's a distinct difference. You can tell the difference between internal and external fertilization because internally fertilized eggs will have a shell, while externally fertilized eggs will not. So the internal has the shell, so they're kind of impenetrable once they're outside, so they wouldn't be able to be externally fertilized. But eggs that have a soft outside are not quite as impenetrable, and those have the capability of being externally fertilized. And so that's the distinction. If you were to ever see eggs chilling in the sand somewhere, you could tell whether it was internal or external by its shell, or lack thereof. Alrighty. And so reproduction in this subphylum is quite complex. There's several different types. There's oviparous, there's ovoviviparous, and viviparous development. All three of these. And as you can see here, oviparous development occurs in an egg that is hatched outside of the female's body. Ovoviviparous development occurs in an egg that is hatched inside the female's body. And viviparous development occurs inside the female, allowing the offspring to gain nutrients and vital substances from the mother through a placenta. So we are right here. That's us, right? We get our nutrients from our mother's placenta internally. All right, so let's do a quick fact check on what we've done thus far, and then we will move on. So it says that we can fight cancer with bone marrow transplants. In the procedure, the bone marrow of the sick person is replaced with the bone marrow from a healthy person. What cells in the body are most affected by this procedure? So this has to do with what we talked about in the previous video lesson. But the answer would be the blood cells are most affected because bone marrow makes blood cells. Remember, you have your red bone marrow in that internal cavity of the bone that produces those blood cells. So this would affect blood cells. Number 2, a shark's skeleton is more flexible than a human skeleton. What is the shark's skeleton most likely made of? That's cartilage. Remember, we talked about how we have bone and cartilage is going to be more flexible. So if this is a flexible skeleton, it's likely cartilage. Number 3, if you see a sealed tube full of bright red blood, did it most likely come from a vein or an artery? That would be that it most likely came from an artery, right? Because most arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart, and therefore that presence of that extra oxygen would mean that it's a brighter red than blood that didn't have as much oxygen. And number 4, blood traveling back to the heart, is it in a vein or an artery? Remember, arteries away from the heart, veins go back to the heart. All right, and a couple more fact check questions. So, it says, although an animal's eyes seem to function properly, it still cannot see. What part of the brain is most likely not working? That goes back to what we just talked about with the lobes of the brain. Most likely the optic lobe is not working properly because that is what detects and sends light signals. Number 2, if a person's spinal cord is cut, he loses the ability to move the limb below the place in which the cut occurred. Why? That would be because the brain sends signals down the spinal cord to the nerves that branch out to the limbs. So if you cut the signals, then that signal cannot travel to that limb and it won't receive the feedback. So that is why people who are quadriplegic or paraplegic, etc., experience this. Number 3, a viviparous mother eats plenty of food, but the developing offspring is not nourished properly. What structure is not performing its job? That would be the placenta is not functioning and performing its job. And lastly, fish typically reproduce when the female lays her eggs and then the male fertilizes them. What kind of fertilization is this, and what kind of development is this? So this would be an example of external fertilization, because the fish is aquatic, so most likely it's going to be external. And the female lays her eggs and then the male fertilizes them after she's already laid them, so external. And then what kind of development is this? This is oviparous development. Okay? Alrighty. Continuing on. We're now talking about class Angantha. All right. And so creatures of this class, they live in both fresh and marine environments. And we typically call these the jawless fish. Okay. And so these two are members of Chordata, but now we are talking about a different class. So we're not talking about subphylum Vertebrata now. We're talking about the jawless fish. And so these are often I can't speak today, guys. Anadromous, which is a life cycle in which the creatures are hatched in fresh water. They migrate to saltwater areas as adults, and then they return back to fresh water to reproduce. So they kind of hop in and out of fresh and salt water throughout their life cycle. And the example that we're going to be talking about for this is the lamprey eel, or just often abbreviated lamprey. And so when the eggs hatch of a lamprey, the young are in the larva form, and they're called amocoites, or codes. I don't even know if I'm saying that right. And they behave very differently at this stage than they would as in their adult form. For one, they feed by producing mucus strands that trap particles. So these long strands of mucus, it's pretty gross. Additionally, they live as larvae for many years, like as many as 7 years, which is very unusual for a creature to live in that stage for so long, until metamorphosis takes place and they develop into an adult lamprey. So that's why we say that when they're in this stage, feeding on the mucus strands, and in the larva stage, they're very different from their adult form after metamorphosis. Okay, and so as an adult, the lamprey develops a large, round, sucker-like jaw, and its jawless mouth is filled with horny teeth and a raspy tongue. And so basically the only thing that supports its jaw versus like we have a jaw bone is a ring of cartilage around its mouth. That's what's in place. And it basically feeds as a parasite, mostly feeding on other vertebrate by attaching this horny teeth, raspy tongue, cartilage jaw to whatever it's attacking, whatever the prey is. And it uses a pumping mechanism to stay attached via suction to its creature. So this is like a blood-sucking leech, basically, that is attached to its prey. And it scrapes the skin of the prey with that raspy tongue, and it sucks its blood. And that's how it gets its nutrients, basically, as a parasite. The lamprey eel has a skeleton made of cartilage, so it never actually truly forms bones, so it's a little bit more flexible. And its skull is composed of overlapping plates that protect its brain. And it has a very small cerebellum in its brain, but it has very large optic lobes, so it allows for great vision for hunting, but it's a smaller, more simplified nervous system because it functions as a parasite, so it doesn't really need as complex of a nervous system, because it's relying on the nutrients from the prey versus needing its own nervous system to coordinate all of that food and digestion. Most vertebrates have areas in their brain which are larger or more developed, depending on the needs of that specific organism. So I'm talking, this varies between different creatures. We as humans have a very, very large cerebrum because God has designed us to be able to think far superiorly and more intellectually than all other creatures on this planet. And so for us, the cerebrum is what's mostly developed. But in here, like we said, the large optic lobes are what are more developed because it has exceptional sight. And so this is what these look like. Pretty ugly. That's just my opinion, I guess. But this is the lamprey mouth with, you can see the horny teeth and the raspy tongue and suckers. And this is a fish that's fallen prey to these lampreys, which you can see are attached like leeches to the side of the fish. And so we're going to close out with another fact check, and then I have a video that you need to watch to sum up these lampreys and to see them in action. So that's important. I will link that below as usual. Please check that out. It is important for our studies. All right, so last slide. Let's do the fact check. It says, are there any lampreys that reproduce in marine environments? Why or why not? No, because remember, they either live their entire lives in freshwater and then migrate back to freshwater for reproduction. So they do not reproduce in the saltwater environment. They will be back in the freshwater environment. Number 2, a student says lampreys are parasites. How should the student's incorrect statement be modified to make it correct? So the phrase should say that adult lampreys are parasites, because in the larva stage, remember, they act very different from their adult stage, and they're in that stage for roughly 7 years, or as long as 7 years, and they use the mucus strands to collect their food at that stage. It's only when they are adults that they have these sucker parasitic attachments to their prey. And number 3, if a vertebrate relies on its sense of, that should not say os, smell, sense of smell for survival, what brain lobes will most likely be larger compared to those of other vertebrates? So if it's sense of smell for survival, it's going to be the olfactory lobes, because that is where you send your sense of smell and nerve signals to your brain. So this organism's olfactory lobes would be much larger than some of the other lobes in its brain. All right, and so again, be sure to check out the video linked below, but that is all for today.